The hit film Dunkirk depicts the historic rescue of Allied troops from Nazi Germany's encirclement during World War II. With no talk of Hitler or fierce battlefields, what are the elements contributing to its global box office success? After arriving in Chinese cinemas on September 1st, the film suffered a sharp drop a week later and so far has not performed as well as it did in the US and UK. Why is there such a gap between the markets? With its focus on soldiers' survival stories, the film recounts the astounding rescue of 338,000 Allied troops from the beaches of Dunkirk in France in 1940. How should people today reflect on the impact of war from an individual perspective? While reinforcing Britain's self-image of fighting for freedom in isolation, the film may have unwittingly been dragged into the Brexit debate. What resonances and political connotations could be drawn from the film?
In 1940, the successful evacuation from Dunkirk of British forces faced with annihilation by the German army eventually proved a turning point in World War II, setting the stage for the ultimate defeat of the Third Reich. 77 years later, Christopher Nolan, a highly regarded and successful film director, has reproduced this historic event on the screen with a fresh perspective. How should we look at the Dunkirk retreat in view of subsequent events, and what has proved so compelling about the story of this piece of history in Nolan's hands? To consider the military retreat of more than 7 decades ago and the blockbuster movie currently in cinemas in China, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Jun Cheng, intercultural filmmaker and film critic, and Teng Jimeng, cultural affairs commentator. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here. Ironically, many British scholars, historians, and movie critics call the Dunkirk evacuation a turning point, if not a huge success for winning the Second World War. What do you make of their allegations and thoughts?
Well, speaking from the point of view of a filmmaker, in the film of Chris Nolan, is a victory. Survival is a victory. But I guess you're asking a question maybe a military general, military historian would answer better, unless Jimeng has some comments.
Yeah, Jimeng always delivers a historic scenario, a grand discourse about history.
Well, I think it was a turning point because that both Britain and France managed to regroup under the pressure of this Nazi onslaught, this Nazi and potentially kind of a slaughter by the Nazi army. The whole thing is about 1940. I mean, during May, which lasted until early June, when the British, I think when the Anglo-British force were basically encircled by the German forces and attacked from the air, by the sea, by the land, and by the cannons, artilleries. And so, in a sense, it's a very, very dangerous situation where almost 400,000 people were out there on the beach and then encircled, facing annihilation by the Nazi Germany. And eventually, Churchill decided to let the army retreat. And so they can reamass, to reassemble back in England and fought the battle which was known eventually as the Battle of Britain.
Here is something debatable, if not very controversial. Many more observers pointed out that the alleged successful evacuation of up to 330,000 British troops, including French allies, from Dunkirk, is a product of luck, planning, and even conspiracy, which has seriously humiliated their French allies.
I think it's the strategy of the moment which turned out to be the right strategy. I don't think it's a conspiracy. But how can we make a judgment just by knowing so little facts?
Look, the French allies were not in carefully planned evacuation by Prime Minister Churchill or the British generals at the summit or in their operational room. So what do you make of this alleged conspiracy? And what do you think of the image of the British admiral, the general, which is the last shot of the movie? I would prefer to stay here with my French allies.
Well, many would view the general as some kind of emblematic of the British gallantry, the British bravery and courage under fire, and perhaps the sort of grace under pressure, I mean, which I call courage. And at the same time, I think that, yes, because of poor planning, poor coordination in between the British and the French, there's some kind of chaos. Historians reveal the fact that at one point, the French army was so mad about this British retreat without coordinating with their allied forces. They even point their guns, the cannons, at the British forces out on the beach. And so, in a sense, yes, it was a very shameful defeat. It was a very poorly organized and poorly coordinated kind of a campaign. But at the same time, the Germans actually are also making this huge mistake. Hitler suddenly decided to stop, attacking, the troops encircled on the beach. And many would say that it's because Hitler wants to strike accommodation or kind of a compromise, or even reach a deal with Churchill. The German military eventually came up with the conclusion that they may not attack this small group of people out there on the beach, totally defeated. It's not because it's not worthwhile.
But I'm afraid the image of Winston Churchill fails to appeal to the mind and heart of their French allies, although this man won Nobel Prize of Literature for his masterpiece on the Second World War. Now, Chen Juan, let me bring you guys back from history to the stage and the screen.
Great.
Strongest impressions of the latest movie with the same name, the size, the scope, the use of the IMAX format, the three-part storyline, the relative balance in the use of dialogue with imagery and music.
I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion of history. I just want to point out Chris Nolan said in many interviews, in particular, he said, Dunkirk is not about history, it's not about politics, it is about the experience of war.
Or about the perceptions of his own about history.
Yes, but most importantly, Chris Nolan wants to create a physical experience for the audience to participate, to empathize with the experience of going through the war. And Dunkirk's spirit, as many say, it is putting together in the face of adversity. So Chris Nolan has created this massive portrayal of war, a psychological war, that he invites audience to participate. We can see many shots from the air, the horizontal skyline turn out to be like Dutch angle or vertical. So you're...
Of course, the image of a British Royal Air Force must be featured prominently at the beginning of the Second World War, right?
But in fact, it was not that very kind of a gallantry that we should see in modern air warfare. I mean, right now, as you can see in that film, both of these two pilots are actually, basically hidden. Their faces are hidden from their helmet. You don't see the real fighter out there, but you see people in the cockpit.
How they look may not appeal to the mind and heart of the audiences, since we all focused our attention on the self, which is quickly running out, and that's the issue of whether they should fight to the last drop of their blood.
Right. It's almost about
utterly defeat the German Air Force, which meant to destroy the warships that were used to evacuate the British troops from the French beach.
I think the realism we need to talk about Dunkirk, because Chris Nolan has been known for making fantasy story, sci-fi story. This is his 10th film, but first time depicting a reality story. So there's a great amount of realism goes into the imagery. For instance, you were not complaining, but talking about this mask face, but that's a real war. I think it's a very intimate portrayal of a soldier who's actually engaging in a defeating enemy kind of mode.
In fact, Chris himself says this is not a war movie, it is a suspense movie.
Right, yes.
Exactly.
So is it really a reality show? I don't think so.
That's what he said.
It's debatable. It is debatable.
I totally celebrated Chris Nolan's take on this suspense perspective, or even this is his great storytelling strategy. Life is a suspense. We don't know every day where we're going to be. So he put this suspense of a lifetime into this microcosm within this very condensed time and space, inviting us to explore the danger of living. Then the other end goal is dying. So the dying is any moment is coming. So the dichotomy of living and dying So it creates the suspense.
That's
or a
what he said,
suspension
right?
of desperation.
Yeah, desperation,
The
yeah,
very
that's what I-
desire
yeah.
and issue of survival itself
Right.
at the defining moment of make or break, to be or not to be, in the words of William Shakespeare.
I would like to repeat what he said during that very interview on that very opening day of the film. And he said, I'm supposed to create an experience of war. I mean, I'm going to create the sense of immersion on the part of the audience. And so, in a sense, the realism is not to be doubted, because the realism is out there in the cockpit, I mean, of that fighter, and also on the boat, on the beach. I mean, everyone seems to be living through that war. I mean, that's why he chose these young actors, as he talked about on that very day. I mean, young actors who had never had any experience of war. And so this is much about involving the audience, the people, even the actors.
The actor is
great
very
talents.
well chosen.
That's right,
We don't know this actor, this person as an actor.
None of them are stars. right?
Exactly.
A-listed
He wanted
stars.
everyday man
Yep.
story. So therefore, it is very well. Very well casted. And we have to talk about the music of this film, which
music?
The music
Why?
plays. Music came first. Chris Nolan said he actually designed his story around the music, just the other way around. He wrote his script 76 page only for this 108-minute film. So he really chose this very experimental music, very propulsive, fast-paced, using shepherd's tone, they say, creating audio illusion to give you like a rising anxiety, so you're perpetually being suspended in this space of danger.
So Chris is building up your expectations and emotions.
Right,
Anxieties
right.
and anticipation of a possible danger.
But the music part of it is something that I am very, very suspicious of. I think the bad experience for Chinese viewers in this country, according to survey, is because of the music. Because the music's so very electronic. It is such a electronically orchestrated kind of a bombardment on the audience. And if you are sitting in movie theaters, you will hear the music from the beginning to the very end, and it is so saturated and it's so full of that very horror.
But I'm
and that very
afraid, guys, the
desperation.
Chinese audiences have been caught unprepared. They're not prepared for the utterly European style
No, they're not.
in portraying a war
You're right.
in the style of Chris Nolan, because the cinematic use of music at the very beginning of this masterpiece turns out to be a very poor box office in the Chinese market. What do you think of the sharp contrast between Wolf Warrior 2 and Dunkirk?
Well, Wolf Warrior 2 is euphoric victory. It's a triumph of one individual hero, in sharp contrast to this very communal sense of heroics in Dunkirk. I mean, it's about this rising star, called Wu Jing, representing the second generation of action star, and emblematically China. China, the rise of China politically, economically, and perhaps militarily in this very particular historical period. And at the same time, it's not about retreat, it's about saving, it's about rescuing, and it's about the demonstration of a very positive power out there, saving our brothers and sisters down in Africa, trapped in that very coup and surrounded by the Western baddies. And so it's a different story, and that's
in
why
fact,
it's valuable.
Dunkirk is not an isolated chapter of a war history. For example, in the Chinese movies of defending Yan'an or Nantong Beidan, we all have a similar line of saying beating retreat is the guarantee of success tomorrow. So this is a strategic planning of a carefully designed retreat. But you are watching Dialogue with Jung and Jimen. We're discussing why Dunkirk evacuation in the Chinese cinemas failed to be a big success. At the same time, this movie deserves credit between and among many of the movie critics and historians. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Yet another big question mark that many Chinese audiences keep repeating is why the Soviet Red Army failed to be portrayed in most of the European movies about the Second World War, despite the huge sacrifice on the Soviet front. I mean, they incurred a heavy loss in defeating eventually the Nazi Germany or the Third Reich. why do you think at the same time China has been a forgotten ally in the same war, despite our huge sacrifice
You know,
in Asia?
everything seems to be political here in China. I mean, even you have to drag into political sensibility into this film discussion. I don't mean you, Yang Rui. I'm talking about Chinese audience. They need to learn how to appreciate film as a piece of artwork versus a sense of propaganda or a sense of national patriotism as if China has to be celebrated all the time. Wolf Warrior is a great film. I like it, particularly Wu Jing's achievement, but it's propaganda at its core. I mean, but
I don't think it's propaganda, John. I don't think there is a government effort involved in promoting
look at the last
film.
scene.
Are you
I
saying
thought,
Wu Jing is in
that was-
love of propaganda?
No, he didn't think
This is a
so.
commercial
But
success.
listen, the very last.
Dunkirk is also part of propaganda. Do you see
Listen,
the
I will
last part of the
address
film?
that issue momentarily. Wolf Warrior, just one last sentence. The last shot of Wolf Warrior is a Chinese path. It is the ultimate propaganda. But that's just my personal point of view. Coming back to Dunkirk, I think it is, you know, Chris Nolan is a British filmmaker, and he grew up with Dunkirk. Dunkirk is a legacy in his culture. So he actually dig out his own legacy to celebrate it, to embrace the humanism of British history. So the Soviet Union is another matter. That's another film. Why we need to talk about that?
We are talking about the general review of the Second World War instead of focusing on the mere movie of Dunkirk evacuation.
Okay, great. That's
So-
a Chinese filmmaker make one.
Okay.
Well, the French.
That's our next
complained.
discussion.
The French complained a lot.
Okay.
The French complained a lot about this Dunkirk retreat without involving the French. The British,
Yeah, I understand.
the Americans also complained about this film in terms of lacking a U.S. soldier of color. I mean, that was.
But John, you know,
part of criticism.
if I were in your shoes, I would have said, well, Ray, not only the Soviet Red Army failed to be featured in the movie, but Germans failed to be featured in the same movie
Yeah.
as well. So
That's
what do
right.
you think of the skills employed by Nolan?
It is not a skill. I think it's propaganda. I mean, the whole thing about letting the enemy disappear from the screen, it's propaganda. You dehumanize your enemy. You just don't give them a face. The enemy doesn't deserve a face in my film. And so, in a sense, this is the socialist realism employed by the Soviet Union back in the 1950s.
Well, the
and
German
German
60s.
totally
soldiers did
disagree.
appear at the very end of
No,
the movie,
we don't see them.
in darkness,
Right,
in
but
shadow,
Wait,
in capturing the
very
listen
palace.
to me. There is a German soldier saved by the merchant ship, and he is a human inside the ship. That is
Which German soldier?
there is a man who was being shot down.
No,
afraid that's the British
we don't see.
pilot.
We
That
don't
was
see
the British
any
sailor,
German soldiers.
perhaps.
You're wrong. You're
I'm
totally
sorry.
wrong.
There may be there's a person that being
That
shot
was,
down.
yeah, that was a British soldier.
Oh, I see.
That was a
So
British
I'm sorry
soldier
about that.
whose ship being sunk by the German U-boat.
At the cost of the
Right.
life of
And
the,
then there's a
the
pilot being
captain's
shot,
son.
yeah.
The captain's son was
Oh, right,
killed.
that's a
Yeah,
British.
the Mark-
That's a
accident.
British.
Mark Rayland's
Okay.
son's boat saved that guy. Right?
But the idea of having to show the enemy, and we don't need to have a physical
No,
enemy
I mean
to be an enemy.
that was a very important part of the film. You don't show your enemy's face. Why?
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 Because the
It's a war
airplane, the
film.
bombing itself is already a threat. They're focusing on the psychological well-being of the soldier. The movie is about the psychological warfare. It's not about the actual warfare. So we need to know the artistic choice of this director who is focusing on this. So this is not politics. This is not history even. It is artistic choice of a portrayal of a war.
But anything can be politics. Anything can be. We are living in a world of politics. Everything can be political. And so
I love Chris Nolan's film.
Sure,
this
yes,
portrayal.
absolutely. I mean, this time around, he's political. Look at the end of the film. The soldiers reading Churchill's address at the
Yeah.
in the parliament. It was a strong proclamation that Britain fight heroically on the beach, out there in the sky, and
Yeah.
everything, and blah
Very
blah blah like that.
uplifting ending.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that?
John,
And that was
I
propaganda.
appreciate and I
That was
believe
politics.
my
A
appreciation is
little bit
shared by.
propaganda in the
my-
end is
I
okay.
appreciate your respect for Nolan, and this appreciation is shared by both Timon and I.
Oh, you do?
However,
It's good to
don't you
have two
think
point of
don't you think to be critical of his masterpiece is yet another way of expressing
Appreciating.
your respect and appreciation? So,
Right.
what do you think of the propaganda, the alleged propaganda symbol of, again, featuring the British general at the very end to uphold the image of a British gentleman, you know, to show their being
I'll stay
patriotic
for the
as well
French.
as to taking side with the French allies. whom they have betrayed, in fact, throughout the whole process of evacuation.
I like his image being the pillar of spirituality, almost as
The backbone of a British
exactly
national ethos, right?
I like that portrayal.
But don't you think that was also a symbol of British nobility? That was a war basically
What's
for the
wrong
British
with
noble.
portrayal
That had nothing to do
backbones?
with the commons. And a war fought between the two empires and has nothing to do with his young soldiers. I think there's a strong anti-war tone out there in the film. I think
I
that
like anti-war tone.
Right. And,
Yeah,
and
it's
that's
good.
politics. And that's politics.
That's not to put
artistic
everything into
at all.
politics. Anti-war is the message of this film.
Yeah.
Humanism is being celebrated in this film. And this film is celebrating humanism not through the portrayal of heroism. It's portraying a communal survival sense. So in this way, I mean, it is about an anti-war epic, not
Well,
war
British
epic.
politics is always expected to be boring, and perhaps Nolan deserves credit for turning the British political boredom into a huge commercial success elsewhere, outside the Chinese market, right? Because it's so popular in other overseas markets instead of the homegrown market here in China. So, what do you think of the Chinese taste for appreciating a war movie, a war subject matter? Is it again back to the issue of politics, as Joan put it in a very controversial way?
I think it's a combination, both politics and also humanism. I think if you look at the film made in 1964 called The Heroic Sons and Daughters, it's a film about the war in Korea and the Korean War, basically. And it's all about this individual hero, Wang Cheng, reuniting with the father, his biological father, out there on the battlefield. It was such a moving film, and I see that as a great potential in terms of remaking and turn it into a blockbuster value film here in China. And so war is about humanism, war is about individual hero, and war is about nationalism and patriotism, because China's special historical, the special.
But I'm afraid there are different
consequences.
ways and approaches in portraying the spirit of heroism. For example, Saving Private Ryan and Normandy, that features Eisenhower himself only. So what do you think of this different angle in, bringing into full play the spirit of patriotism and heroism?
Saving Private Ryan by Steven Spielberg is a very savage portrayal of war. It's taking a different approach. He is very realistically portraying a 27-minute opening scene all on the beach. So that's very, very bloody, a lot of bombing. Chris Nolan taking it internally, bring you inside the mind or the body of the soldier or of the audience. He said it is the physicality he wants to create. He wants you to feel you are under the water. He wants you to feel if you can cross to the bridge.
Well, that reminds me of a punchline
approach.
of New Concept English: "A gentleman is rather than does."
Oh wow!
Let me just
I like
add,
that.
let me just add a footnote to Joanne to your question. I think the whole difference about Saving Private Ryan and perhaps The Heroic Sons and Daughters in China is that Saving Private Ryan is all about a nation spending its national effort to rescue this young brother in order to save that family from, basically the annihilations of the sons and the whole family. Wang Cheng is all about one individual hero fighting and fighting to the very last blood. It's not about saving this very young son to carry out his family name. It's all about sacrifice. So heroic is all about sacrifice, commitment, and sometimes I would say serving the nation. Well, in Saving Private Ryan, there's nothing about, let's save our nation, let's sacrifice for our nation. No, let's stop sacrificing. Let's save that young guy and take him home to his parents.
So exactly,
It's
Dunkirk
individualism.
Now,
whereas the
Dunkirk
last our
is
collectivism.
about saving
okay,
life too.
my last question is very much about something philosophical, profound philosophical message.
You look philosophical, sorry.
Part of Chinese culture, I'm afraid, aesthetically speaking, is to have a happy end. Movies, literature, drama, we tend to celebrate a big success instead of a retreat, a tragic retreat of thousands of soldiers from the beach where you only got the sense of desperation. Here, in sharp contrast, we had the stark contrast in Nolan's masterpiece of featuring thousands of British soldiers waiting hopelessly for the silver lining in the darkest clouds. I mean, this is quite against the Chinese psyche artistically.
But the ending is quite victorious. The very line really pinpoints the theme of the film, which is survival is victory. You see a huge amount of private boats, jets, all these fishing boats coming together. That's the only moment, a happy moment.
But the process
moment
itself is very painful, don't you think so?
Right, but we're talking about the
What about
ending.
the train? Yeah,
the
the
ending
What
is
about the
very
train scene,
hopeful.
Joanne? What about the train scene? Can you just decipher the train scene when the young soldiers are reading the newspaper?
I
That
love
was
the
the ending
train
scene.
scene. I know you're going to say it's a propaganda. I think it is
No, it's victory. It's a victory. It's not.
Yeah, the victory.
Yeah, the victory part.
Winston Churchill's
speech, yeah.
speech. I think that summarized the spirit of Dunkirk. That is a spirit of
It's yet
of
another
victory.
way by the print media to show the V sign.
Yeah,
right?
right.
I like
Well,
the ending. It's very human.
right.
It's very victorious.
In
a
fact,
very
I want
calm
to
way.
take you guys to what William Shakespeare prefers to portray in his big writings. For example, tragedy. Tragedy itself. What do you think of the overtones of being tragic in Nolan's masterpiece?
When Nolan sees sees tragedy. Let me see, tragedy in this potential, in this man-made triumph. I would say, if you look at the very ending, and you will find the soldier speaking for Churchill. See, this is not about one individual leader being the hero. It's about this it is about this director using the young man's voice to speak for Churchill, to speak for a potential hero. But then once again, if you look at that very young man, he's very sad, he's very gloomy, he's not even bold enough to take the beer handed over to
Perhaps
him.
we should call Christopher Nolan
Oh well,
the present-day Hamlet. Right.
He's hesitating. He's hesitating.
But
He's desperate.
Chris Nolan said one thing very quickly. He said that he doesn't want to dramatize the emotion. So every actors there try to keep quiet, meaning withhold their emotion. So this is a film not glorifying.
Very quickly, do you think this guy, Nolan, stands a good chance of winning Oscar?
Yes.
Your vote?
I don't think so.
Thank you so much for your honest reply. With that, we come to the end of this discussion about Dunkirk evacuation. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.